everyone. If everyone could take a moment to rename yourself with your name and the name of your school or organization, that I think will help everyone be refreshed and have a sense of who's in the room. This is the first of our learning gatherings for the school year, and it's an opportunity for us to take 90 minutes to delve into a pivotal text that relates to our theme of the year, E Pluribus Unum, exploring unity and difference in America, and hopefully also come away with some new ideas of how you might use this text in your classroom. So I'm thrilled to welcome back Professor Lucas Morel, who will be teaching us this evening. And I'm going to pass it over to Professor Morel. If everyone could please mute themselves, and we will go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Yale, and all the folks at Civic Spirit. It's been great working with you and doing this teaching. Next best thing, alas, with COVID, to being there. I don't like to lecture, so I'm really looking forward to having your comments and observations and questions, of course, about this text. What I want to do is, if possible, as we get going, if you're ready to say something, go ahead and just unmute yourself and jump in. And if it turns out every time that happens, 3 people do it at the same time, like Three Stooges style, then I'll have to start calling on people. But what I want to do is make it a conversation in the room. In other words, it's not just you talking to me, talking to you, talking to me. I want you guys to be thinking about what others are saying. And if you have a comment about what someone else said, their reading of a particular passage or interpretation, I want you and invite you. I welcome that. And so you don't need me to give you permission to do that. But again, if after a while it seems like you guys are going berserker with that and talking over each other, then I'm going to just throw down on all of you and mute all of you guys. Actually, I don't have that power, but we'll all go back to mute, and then I'll just call on you. And in that sense, don't use the chat thing. Just put your hand by your face like I'm doing right now, and then I'll call on you. But as I said, I like to drive my classes where I teach at Washington and Lee University. I don't lecture there. I drive my classes with questions, and my students come to class expecting that. And so my first question, in fact, is going to be a show of hands here. How many of you are fairly familiar with this text, have either taught it before or have read it before this particular event? I'm seeing maybe 4 or 5 hands, and okay, oh, maybe about half. All right, that's good. I want to take, we're going to be, you know, it's my watch shows 7:03, 7:04. I'm going to be working us through this text with it, which is, as you know, super rich, with some questions for about an hour. And if it looks like we're just breezing our way through, I've got other questions, and also I can fill in some of the backstory as needed, and don't be shy to ask about that stuff as well. So unless anybody has any burning questions at the outset, one thing that I always slow my students down to really consider in this text is how King used the tactic of protest, how premeditated it was. In other words, it wasn't something like shoot from the hip, and it was actually a multi-stage or multi-step process. So can somebody recount for us what were those 4 steps that King laid out and explained to the 8 clergymen in order for them to have a better sense of how King was doing things in Birmingham? Do you guys remember when he talked about that fairly early in the text? Somebody want to direct our attention to that? Here's that part where you unmute yourself and just jump right in.
Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in. Oh,
okay.
I won't jump.
Go ahead, John.
So I was just so impressed with how he laid claim to the right to participate in this protest. He was head of an organization. There were people in Birmingham who were oppressed, and he just went through the steps, if I'm understanding your question correctly, of having a right as the head of this organization to be involved in this. And I think that was one of the steps.
Okay, so that one is actually more of a meta answer to a meta question, which is the one of the complaints that the clergyman had was that, look, King, it's great what you did where you live and where you're from, but this is Birmingham. This is our town, and we'll take care of this if you don't mind. In other words, King started this letter by addressing the question of being an outsider, quote unquote. And he goes on to explain why he doesn't think that he is an outsider and gives various reasons for that. I was asking something much more mundane, which is the actual process by which they determine whether they're going to even conduct direct action protest demonstration. But I don't mind your answer at all, because I think it's an important one, and it's, you know, one of the most famous quotations that he is known for, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so King says, I'm in Birmingham, even though I'm not a Birmingham citizen, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is in Birmingham. In other words, that's where the problem is. Where do you want me to go? Where there are no problems? So King thinks it's fairly obvious, at least that fundamental reason why he's in Birmingham. What else on that question? What other, Marissa, go ahead.
I was gonna try to answer your question about the 4 basic steps, because I found
Go for it. Go for it.
I found it. Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Yeah, and it was really striking to me. Also, what Jonathan said about how, like, he laid out the reasons for why this all happened and why he is where he is and why things have kind of unfolded the way that they have. And so, but anyway, those were his 4 basic steps as to how they got to where they were.
All right. So why do you think it's important that King showed them that there were 4 steps to protest, not 1 step? Why not just move right to protest when you hear that something bad has happened? Why is that helpful for the clergyman to know?
I think it's because protests can sometimes look like anarchy. This shows it clearly isn't. This is very, very much organized and planned, and it wasn't just something that happened spontaneously.
Yes.
They knew what they were doing and checked to make sure that they weren't violating any of the principles that they wanted to uphold. Very good. Adrian, you had your hand up?
No, that was exactly what I was going to make mention of, that, you know, this was something that was not, you know, fly by night, but it was something that was actually well considered, well planned, well thought through, that we do have a process here. Yes. And therefore, if you are not aware, let me make you aware.
Very good. Stacy?
I like too the fact, I think it just gives credibility to what they're doing, because you can have a very well thought out and planned thing and it still is based off of incorrect assumptions or whatever else. But the fact that he went through and said, we collected our information and right, here are the facts, gives great credibility to what he was doing.
Yeah, very good. I'm sorry, Ben, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. And notice for King that protest isn't the end all and be all. I mean, that's his signature tactic, no doubt about it. He will eventually win a Nobel Peace Prize the following year, in great part because of his leadership as a protest organizer and movement organizer. But for King, the point is reform. The point is to do whatever it is that will produce the outcome. And the outcome for him, of course, is justice. And to get justice, in King's mind, you don't have to protest. If people are acting in good faith, King says, I'll come to the table if you're acting in good faith. If we find out that the facts are, as in this case, Fred Shuttlesworth, a giant in the civil rights movement. He was the one who sent the message to King and said, we need you here. Here are the problems. We've been living with these problems for way too long. We think you can be helpful. And through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, among other organizations, that was the invite that brought King. And King was, and the movement was not dealt with in good faith in Albany, Georgia, right? There they were lied to, and they left before the reforms were implemented. And guess what happened? Nothing. And so fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And King and Abernathy and the rest of the movement organizers were not going to get fooled a second time. And so this time, again, collect the facts. Is there injustice? Yes. Second, not protest. Look at the second step, right? Let's come to the table. In other words, we don't have to make a big deal out in the streets, demonstration. We can work behind closed doors, if you will, with people of goodwill who will be honest about the problems, and let's work this thing out. Those negotiations did not pan out. Notice what isn't step 3, protest. Why is step 3 important? Somebody want to chime in on that? What on earth is self-purification, and what does that have to do with protest? Adrian?
Yeah, I think the letter spoke to it just somewhat vaguely, excuse me, wherein it's a process of making sure that one is prepared for what they are getting ready to get themselves involved in, for one. And then secondly, where are your motives? What is your intent? What is your purpose? So it's a consideration of why you're doing what you're getting ready to do.
Thank you. Harley?
Yeah, just a question / comment, because I think it's a fascinating step in this continuum of steps, but it feels like the first 2 steps are kind of, I mean, I think he's talking about them like genuinely, but there's also kind of a PR component there, like explaining and rationalizing. This 3rd step, I can see it being extraordinarily important for an internal kind of management perspective, but why is it part of the 4 steps that he like promotes to the outside world? Like, is there any value to telling people that there's a self-purification step involved?
Well, the most important value is to the people who are undergoing the self-purification. I'm going to state that right up front, and I'm going to back that up in a second. But I think for the clergymen, and it's good, remember, we've got 2 audiences here. You mentioned, or someone mentioned PR, public relations. This letter, it began to be written. He began writing it on the margin of the the Birmingham News, right? One of the jail trustees snuck him a newspaper, and somehow King got a pencil. I haven't been, to my shame, I haven't been to the museum. Is that on display anywhere? But apparently he started writing it on the margins of the newspaper. And this was not published until he had, I mean, this thing is like 7,100 words, if I'm not mistaken. It is extremely well researched. He is citing philosophers, theologians, iconic Americans, people you never even heard of. I mean, he is all over the place. He is firing on all cylinders. This was, yes, intended as a response to these 8 clergymen who thought that King was basically being a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser, and he should go back to his pulpit, as it were. And King said, I'll respond to you guys, but I'm going to do it in a way with America looking over your shoulder. So you are right. This essay, this letter, if it was just a letter, it would have went to 8 different addresses. This was published as a pamphlet, and then it was republished. You'll see different versions of this letter from Birmingham Jail. If you went on the internet, the wording isn't all correct. Some of the paragraphs are in different order, but this was definitely intended for a national audience. But coming back to the more specific point of self-purification, what does King, by this point in time, remember, he's been at this since the mid-50s. He became known to America when he was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. which led the boycott of the buses in Montgomery, right? Famously sparked by Rosa Parks's refusal to stand up. Now, you should keep in mind that name, Montgomery. Notice who benefits if desegregation occurs in Montgomery. Not just Black people, the entire citizenry, right? So it was about improving Montgomery. So now we're in Birmingham. King means this. He's been at this for almost 10 years now. King knows that they are going to be nonviolent, but their nonviolence is likely to provoke violence. And that's one of the complaints of the clergymen. The clergymen say, look, you can preach nonviolence all you want, but every time you show up and you do your nonviolent thing, if a mob breaks out, gee, who are we going to blame? And so they're blaming King for the unrest, and King has to respond to that, and he glories in responding to it. We're going to get to that in a second. But so the short version is, why do you have to purify yourself? If you know that violence is coming and you intend to have a nonviolent movement, that cannot work. It will not be successful unless you have prepared spiritually. In other words, in your soul. Today we use the Greek word psyche. It's the same word for soul, right? If any of you are familiar with the Eyes on the Prize documentary series, and if you're not, get familiar with it. It is awesome, all the footage they have. And they have footage of these guys practicing. And guess what you have to do when you practice in preparation for violence? Some of the protest members had to be the racists, had to shout nasty things and shove them and do things to get them used to the abuse that they are going to experience. It's going to be abuse of tongue and of fist, if not actual, bricks and so forth. And King did not think they could be successful as nonviolent protesters if they didn't get their center, as it were. And by the way, he was a Christian, of course, he was a preacher. You did not have to be a Christian. You didn't have to be a Jew. You didn't have to be someone of that particular religious faith. But King was very clear that if you were not a believer in some spiritual force that was on the side of justice, you would not be helpful for the movement. You would have to find some other things to do. Now, did any of you get a chance to look at the commitment card? Did we give them a link? Yale or Lindsay, did we give them a link to the commitment card?
It's our party favor. We'll be giving it to them.
Well, okay, I'm gonna spoiler.
We can pull it up.
Spoiler alert. I'm just gonna read a few things. And as I said, what King said is, look, if you don't think you can have people say nasty things about your mom and about you and not want to hit back or whatever, you can contribute to the movement in some other ways, but you don't get to walk with us. Sorry, you've got to be in control. They are going to be out of control. You have to be in control. Number one thing on his list that you had to pledge: meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Again, you don't have to be a Christian to do that, right? But King thought, boy, this will really help you if you read about this particular person. He says, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. And then this one, refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, and heart. Now, he mentioned 7 other things. All of these are ways that King said, look, you don't just show up and go, oh, there's King, I'm going to walk behind him. He's like, my movement does not work that way. If you're serious about this, and we're going to be breaking a law, by the way, in this case, it was a court order. You have to come spiritually prepared to be nonviolent. And it's not something that comes to people naturally. And so you've got to walk this way, think this way, talk this way on a daily basis. So when we arrange for a demonstration, you're ready. So that self-purification, long wind up there. I think fundamentally it was for the people who are actually participating. It was a serious thing. It wasn't simply part of the public relations that King is doing. It's his way of responding to the charge that they are provoking violence in a reckless manner. And King could not have any of the movement marchers and demonstrators, if you will, step out of line. They had to obey the organizers of the march, and they had to keep their mouths closed. And when they felt like hitting back, they had to have the intestinal fortitude not to hit back, to be successful. Okay. So this I think is very helpful for my students to see how, again, someone already mentioned that this isn't something of fly by night, kind of reckless. Let's just, hey, we heard something happen this morning. Tonight, we're going to do the following, which is not to say that there isn't a reason to call attention to things like that. But if you're going to have a mass demonstration, King says, unless it's under discipline, it could lead to our becoming the mob. And that would be destructive of the movement. Now I'm talking too much. Does that help? Anybody have questions about that or want to make a comment about that? All right. One of the strongest criticisms, and King actually acknowledges this in the letter, is that King is actually promoting lawlessness by violating that court order, by disobeying a law. And the charge is, look, King, how can you say people should decide to disobey a law when at the end of the day, you want the law to protect you? You want that protection of civil rights and political rights. So how can you use civil disobedience as a citizen, disobeying a law, or in this case, a court order? How does lawlessness lead to lawfulness? How does he respond to that charge? He says it's a serious one. I'll give you an example. This is 1963, April. May 17th, 1954, Brown v. Board of Education is handed down by the Supreme Court. Unanimous, 9-0 opinion that desegregates public schools K through 12. What happens in my state, the Commonwealth of Virginia? Massive resistance. Congressmen are they sign this manifesto telling their citizens back home to do everything they can to obstruct the implementation of what they see as an unconstitutional decision by the Supreme Court. And so would King want, is that a form of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience that King would approve of? Is King, he's the only one who gets to decide which are the bad laws and which are the good ones? You see the problem here? Marissa?
Well, from his own words, he says that there are just laws and there are unjust laws, and an unjust law is no law at all. And that similarly to, I don't think he actually quotes, but I'm surprised if he didn't quote the Declaration of Independence, where they feel as well that if something is going against basic humanity, then it should not be upheld. It should actually be fought back against. And that, to me, they were parallel in that sense, that even though I don't believe that he actually references the Declaration at all, but his justification for all of it is, if this is not justified, if this is not inclusive of everybody, then it's not something that we necessarily need to abide by.
Okay, very good. Yeah, he could have said, like in the Declaration, they talked about that thing called the laws of nature, nature's God. In other words, that was done explicitly in contrast to man-made laws and edicts by the king as well as Parliament, but especially the king, that were oppressive acts. Nia?
Hi. So I also was looking at this text in a class that I'm doing at Hugsy. And first of all, I just want to really thank Lindsay for inviting me to this event, who also went to Hugsy. And one of the things that I was really interested in about like how we looked at this text, which is in a negotiation class, is his use of something that's called criteria, which are things that exist outside of the specific terms that are being negotiated that can be used as kind of anchors to talk about the value of a certain point or the value of a certain number that you're showing down. And he, in talking about these just laws and unjust laws, he calls on a very old and kind of well-established idea in, I would say, European law, including that of the Declaration of Independence, but also I think it even calls back to the play Antigone by Sophocles, which talks about how there is a need for, in ancient Rome, there's or in ancient Greece, there's a need for calling on laws that are beyond the laws that are set by man.
Yes.
And so by that, MLK he's really showing that he respects the original, the criteria that are set forth even by white people and by Europeans as to what they value. They value this like higher than man-made law. And he calls on that to kind of set this negotiating standard with them, which I think is really beautiful.
Yes, that's excellent. And I think that's well put. If you look on the text that we sent you is your page 3. Sorry for the small font, but saving trees. There we go. Look at the different authorities that King cites to show that there is this tradition of appealing to a standard of ethical, moral conduct within a nation, within a city-state, within a political community, that actually ought to inform the laws that we eventually promulgate, right, through human authority. Philosophers refer to the human laws that are posited as positive law or legal positivism. We know that at least in the United States, you drive on the right side of the road. In England, you drive on the left. I don't know that there's an eternal standard that would say one is any better than the other, but you got to make that decision one way or another, or else it's chaos. We bump into each other. Okay. But not all laws are like that, right? Laws against theft, laws against murder, right? And I could go down the list. These somehow we understand deal with wrongs as wrongs. In other words, they're not wrong because we say so. We say they're wrong because it is so. Okay. And King refers to these as eternal and natural law. The Lockean expression in the Declaration is the laws of nature and nature's God. But look at the authorities. This is on page 3 that he cites. And here it's very helpful to remember the immediate audience. A rabbi, and then Protestant and Catholic Christian preachers and priests. Okay. So you've got this very well-versed men of the cloth, as it were, and they know these authorities, but also Americans generally know who these authorities are as well. So who are they? Thomas Aquinas, okay? Aquinas and Augustine, I mean, they're the K2 and Mount Everest in Catholic theology in terms of understanding laws that are transcendent or beyond human beings. But King is mindful, of course, that he's got a rabbi in there as well. So he does what he can always to do that little toe touch, either in the Old Testament or in this case, Martin Buber, right? The I and the thou. Buber's in there, not Bieber. Buber, make that clear to your students, okay? Paul Tillich, very famous 20th century theologian. So King is showing off his seminary chops there and collegiate chops by making reference to all of these authorities that show that King didn't just magically out of nowhere decide, well, I don't like this human law and I just happen to think it's unjust. No, he's saying that there is this tradition of judging our own political actions, especially either court orders or laws, in light of what's truly just. If we're interested in justice, at the end of the day, simply obeying all the laws doesn't get you to justice. Because what if the laws aren't all just? That's precisely what King is trying to shine a light on. Jason, sorry.
So what happens? It's interesting because so he's quoting these theologians and philosophers who are religious, and he seems to refer to these principles as religious laws down near the it's at the bottom of the third paragraph on page 3, or the third paragraph from the bottom at the end, where
Right.
he talks about disobeying anti-religious laws.
Right.
And then at the end of the letter, he talks about them being like Judeo-Christian heritage, the values in our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Yes.
So he seems to really be putting a big emphasis on religion and how religion creates these laws. So what does that mean in a religionless society? I'm not trying to like ask a loaded question or anything. I'm actually
No.
asking.
That is, if that question, if you teach this text and that question doesn't come up, your students are not awake. Because the fact of the matter is, even though he published this in the 1960s, it's 2021. And you can ask any surveyor, Pew, any pollster, and they will tell you we are a less religious society in America, at least, and it's true for Europe, among other places. So in that sense, we are less familiar, let alone observant, in terms of either Jewish law or Christian law or theology. That, I mean, there's no question about that. But more importantly, I think, we're also more diverse religiously. Where King could say back in the 60s, he could kind of assume that basically most of America was Jewish or American, right? More or less.
He seems to not like that there's a Muslim group that's not Christian, or he like mentions them.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a different. Hold on to that.
Yeah, maybe I might not have the background here.
No, look, what King is doing there, he is talking about a particular sect that refers to themselves as Muslims, but neither Sunnis nor Shiites consider the Nation of Islam an orthodox sect of Islam. So the Nation of Islam, most famously, of course, the most famous spokesperson was Malcolm X, speaking on behalf of Elijah Muhammad, and now it's Louis Farrakhan. That organization, most Orthodox, even Orthodox American Muslims would not see the Nation of Islam as an Orthodox Muslim sect. But be that as it may, King's point, I mean, here's the point that we do have to wrestle with is it fair for King or anybody in this country to make a religious appeal on behalf of justice to people who do not happen to share that religion? So here's the question. On this page, how would King respond to that? What has he told us about this transcendent law that could very well still resonate with people who aren't Jewish or Christian or Muslim, regardless of whether it's Orthodox or unorthodox? What is it that King is alerting any reader who is serious about the notion of justice? What is he calling to their attention? And yes, he is a preacher after all, using a particular faith expression to make that appeal. In other words, what argument would King make in response to Jason's very legitimate question? Daphne?
I think it's tricky because I answered that question and it's due to like How can you be so religious, but yet you're rude to people of color?
I didn't get that last one. You're what to people of color?
You're so religious, but yet like they're rude to people of color. And what I understood was that King wanted them to defer both things.
Yeah, does someone else, can someone else restate or rephrase her question? Because I'm not sure I'm clear on what's being what the comment is. Are you calling out in the 60s a hypocrisy on behalf of a churched Southern white population that would, on the one hand, claim that they're followers of Jesus, but on the other hand, pass segregation laws? Is that what you're putting your finger on? Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, that I think that's manifest that is the case. King would just say to them, his answer to them is the answer to American citizens who claim they believe in equality and do the same thing, right? Don't treat people equally. His claim was always, all we ask is that you be true to what you said on paper, right? If we said something else, if we, like the Confederate Constitution, said that that white supremacy is the premise of our new system, then we would be having an entirely different conversation. What King is saying is, look, you Americans, you guys wrote the Declaration, you wrote the Constitution. It's in English. I read it. This seems to include me. And if it doesn't, I need you to spell that out for me. So the observation about hypocrisy, King had an answer for that. But I still want to hear from more people about this question of, in a more religiously pluralistic society, is it fair for King to cite various theologians of Jewish and Christian and Protestant and Catholic faith expressions? Is it fair for him to make that appeal when his audience may not be observant religiously in those ways? I'm going to say he can, but I want to hear from you guys.
I would say that we're all children of God, and for that reason, as a preacher coming from a faith community in a society that might be less religious now, but still adheres to this idea of religion, that would be the basis of his argument, that all children of God belong in American society, and everyone deserves to be treated equally. That's what I would.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jonathan. But the question is, well, what if I don't believe in God? How does King help me? In other words, do I have to become a Baptist to join the movement, join the struggle, and work for progress in civil and political rights? Or is King suggesting, let me just finish with this. Is King implying something about that appeal to what he calls eternal and natural law? Is he implying something to the reader about whether it's necessary to be Jewish or Christian in order to believe that there are transcendent principles of justice that should shape a political community? Edward, do you have Edward, you got a hand up there?
Yeah, so one thing that's sticking out to me is that that in that second paragraph, he says an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law, and that is sort of the definition. And then all of the religious sources are examples of that. And so the argument in that framing would seem to be there's this universal principle that then can be illustrated with these different examples, but the examples are not exhaustive. They're just singular instances.
So there are examples of this thing out there that if you're Jewish, you have apprehended it or understood it in a particular way, right? And it's Torah and it's other writings. And if you're Catholic, as I said, Augustine and Aquinas are at the top there, among other things. And Protestants have their theologians. Nia?
Yeah, I do think it is worth mentioning that his like repudiating the Nation of Islam and the movement by Elijah Muhammad, I think it's worth saying that there is clearly something that he believes is the wrong way to go about things. And I think that
Yes.
he has kind of reverse engineered some of the most, what he believes to be the most defining laws of Christianity into a set of principles that can be applied to different religions, that can be shared regardless of whether or not you're Christian, but are not common amongst all Black people at the time.
Right.
And I think that that's really interesting because it's not, he's not using what would be seen as, you know, his positionality as a Black man. He's not using what would be expected of him in terms of kinship, in terms of brotherhood. He's not relating to other Black people more than he's relating to people who share those common principles, regardless of if they're Christian.
Yeah, and this is something, of course, that he's going to repeat in August of '63 in his I Have a Dream speech. He mentions the Nation of Islam again there in a disparaging way. And so it's not, this is a consistent thing for him. And there, I think it's fairly easy to say that King is, that's part of the political aspect of the movement. The movement isn't some just kumbaya, let's all feel the same way about each other and pass the s'mores. It's, he is, I mean, good grief, why the original venue for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and I borrowed glory here. I have one of the buttons that King wore. I don't have his, obviously, but the button that King and many others wore that day, I wear it anytime I lecture on King. As I say, borrowed glory. The original venue was not the Lincoln Memorial. Can you guess where in Washington, D.C. in 1963, given what was going on that summer, where was the original venue supposed to be? I did mention Washington, D.C., right? The Capitol. Why the Capitol? Not the White House, not the Supreme Court building. What happens in the Capitol? Laws are passed. The only picture we have of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. is from that summer in a hallway in the Capitol. Somebody manages to take a picture of the two of them right next to each other, looking at each other. What are they doing that summer? They are watching the committees and the filibustering that's going on with regards to the Civil Rights Bill in 1963, the bill that will eventually get passed the following year. So the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, that has a political objective. They want stronger civil rights enforcement, stronger than 1960 version, stronger than the 1957 version. And lo and behold, who's going to be key to passing that law in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65? It's going to be Johnson, who was pivotal in getting those earlier civil rights bills passed. So King, back to your point about the Nation of Islam, King is making a political appeal there. He is trying to say, look, you should work with us because we believe in America. The Nation of Islam does not. You should work with us because we share the same religious heritage that you do. The Nation of Islam does not. So King is being very tactical there and very political, in my opinion, by saying, look, you could either work with me or try to deal with the Nation of Islam. And I'm telling you right now, you're better off talking to me than talking to Malcolm X. Okay. So let's start, but I want to come back and tie up this point because I want to look at a few other things in this speech. I'm going to make reference to something that you did not read, but something that King wrote on this question of, do you have to be a Baptist, right? Do you have to be a Christian to be a part of the movement? He wrote an essay called The Power of Nonviolence in 1958, The Power of Nonviolence. And this is just very briefly, he says, I'm quite aware of the fact that there are persons who believe firmly in nonviolence who do not believe in a personal God. So this is King in 1958. But I think every person who believes in nonviolent resistance believes somehow that the universe in some form is on the side of justice. And so what King is trying to do here is trying to shore up the commitment of those who are in agreement with King in terms of nonviolence rather than violence as the key to social and political reform. Agree with King on that, even though they aren't of the same religious faith heritage. And he says that's okay, but nonviolence, I'm telling you up front, nonviolence is not going to work unless you think that there really is some force out there, a God, force of the universe, moral economy of the universe, I don't care what you call it. Unless you believe somebody else is really in charge of how things are going down here. You know, the whole arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. If you don't believe in that, then you're probably, you're not probably cut out for how we are going about this business of civil rights reform. Now, let me mention another thing. How does King show that in disobeying a particular law or a court order, as I keep repeating in this instance, which is what he was doing, he was violating a court order not to protest during Easter weekend. How do the protesters demonstrate that they actually are believers in the rule of law, that they are actually upholders of the regime and not anarchists? Do you remember the mundane observation that King makes to demonstrate this? And this is part of his answer to the charge that, well, good grief, you're civil disobedience, you're breaking the law in order to change the law. Don't you want people to obey the law after it's changed? That doesn't make sense. That seems like a contradiction in terms. He goes on to explain how to break a law. You see that passage? Carla, it seems like you're saying something. Are you? No?
I'm sorry, don't mind me. I was just eating.
Oh, you can eat. That's fine.
Is it on I might be using it. Oh, page 275. I'm not sure if the PDF is the same as when it starts with, I hope you are able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out.
Go ahead and read it.
I hope that you're able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as would the rabid segregationist do, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I have the corrections as well on this PDF.
Yeah, so there are different versions of it, and so he doesn't express it quite in that way, but that's exceedingly important. What King says is, look, we don't do this in the dark of night. We're not bombing, and we're not disobeying in a way that's destructive of property. We do it in broad daylight. We hope the press reports on it, and we willingly comply with the authority and suffer the punishment that is issued by the courts of law. In other words, we are going to break a law to call attention to the injustice of this particular law, but we are going to obey the government's punishment of it right? Even though we think it's a bad law, we're going to suffer the punishment to reinforce what? The idea that government exists to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. We think skin color, race, and ethnicity should not be a mark of guilt in this country. It shouldn't be punished. It shouldn't be treated in a second-class manner. We willingly accept the punishment for it. And in so doing, we're showing people that we support government. We support the rule of law. We support courts, but we are disobeying in this particular instance to awaken the conscience of this country so that they can see that even though we are suffering the punishment, it is wrong to be punished for what we are doing because it isn't a law or a court order that ultimately should be in place because it isn't upholding justice. And so I think in a way, the general answer to the question of religious diversity or whether, can you be an American and be an atheist or agnostic and still be in support of greater progress in social or in civil and political rights? I think King's answer is, well, do you believe in justice? Do you believe in a moral standard that transcends any human institution, laws, and courts? And if so, then the examples, as was pointed out earlier, the examples that I have given from different faith expressions, religious faith expressions, are ways for us to see how we can look at human laws and determine whether they should be changed or not, whether they should be revised or improved in any way, which raises a question. We don't have time to deal with it, but I think it is a serious problem for folks who don't have a belief in a transcendent standard of justice. They would have a problem explaining or persuading anyone that their way of organizing civil society or any law that they would pass that they think they could, that would be more conducive of human flourishing, they would have a very difficult time doing it without a notion of some higher law, whatever your source of that would be, whether it's religious or philosophic. And so I think King does what he can throughout this letter to appeal to different sources, some theological, many theological, some simply part of America's political history. Like a good lawyer, right? He makes as many arguments as possible, hoping that one of them or more will land. All right, let me bring up a related question. And it's one that King addresses in a couple of points in this essay, and I think he does it very deftly. And it's related to the question of the provocation of violence by nonviolent protests. And it's the concept of tension. King thinks, yes, our nonviolence does produce tension. He says, I admit that. But I think there can be a creative way to produce tension that doesn't simply lead to mob violence or anarchy. Do you guys remember when he talks about the creative uses of tension? Can somebody tease that out for us? Because I think this is intrinsic to how he believes ultimately that laws will be changed by a political community, that this is part of that, stirring up that tension. What does he say about tension in this letter? I saw a few heads nodding, so just jump in.
So I believe he says, in order to open the doors for negotiation and to sort of shake off the air of complacency, there needs to be tension. And he quotes as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals can rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis. He believes that in order to get to that point where negotiation and talks could happen, you need to have that first step, even if it's uncomfortable.
Okay, very good. Do you have a page site on that? So if folks want to.
Yeah, I think it's from the PDF. It's on page 2. It's the second bigger paragraph on the page.
Thank you. Others on this, on the use of tension, or how King explains how tension can actually be a productive thing. I think of tension in, I don't know about you, I don't like tension. I like to be relaxed. I like to be at peace and content. King says, well, tension could be good. So how else does he appeal to tension as being, again, a way to a cure rather than something that simply is divisive or disruptive? Marissa?
In that same paragraph, he talks about how it leads to talking and it leads to negotiation, that you are pushed towards the brink of change because there's nowhere else to go. You have to talk about it. And so what he says is, so the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis packed that it will inevitably open the door for negotiation. We therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has my highlighting is too dark. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than dialogue. And something else that I noticed from this section of his writing is something that we see over and over again in history, unfortunately, that the privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily, that we have to push towards tension so that people can, reflect, take a step back and see that, that, like Carla said, like complacency is not really the way that things are going to change.
Yeah, think about, ask it. One way to get, especially students, to think about is, does King produce the tension? And I think the letter implies that, after all, there's probably a lot of stuff brewing already in Birmingham. In other words, King doesn't show up with Ralph Abernathy and the whole crew, and they bring this baggage of tension with them and they spread it around. In fact, what they do is they reveal the tension that is already there. And in fact, odds are, and this was key for his desire to change things that will have to happen on a nationwide basis, is he had to make this a national effort. In other words, he had to get the majority population of the United States, which was a white population, he had to get them aware of what is going on in certain pockets of the country, and that people were just, flabbergasted when they saw what was going down, what was going on there. Bull Connor, right? One of his positions was, believe it or not, Commissioner of Public Safety. That was his title. This is the guy with the German Shepherd dogs, the guy with the fire hoses. That's the Commissioner of Public Safety. Most people in America were not aware that Eugene Bull Theophilus, lover of God, translated, Connor was implementing justice as he understood it through the use of fire hoses and police dogs. So that tension that's already there, those racist mobs that would show up, King was essentially trying to say, look, we can't afford, especially Black Birmingham citizens, and they made up 40% of the population of Birmingham at that time. They can't afford to live with that tension anymore. And the way to get whites to deal with it is to have them feel the tension as well. And King was willing to risk that. King was willing, again, self-purification is the third step. He was willing to release that tension, and if you will, be responsible for that if it could be managed productively. And that is ultimately the goal of this letter, is to justify nonviolent direct action, which includes civil disobedience, it was this letter's purpose was to justify this tactic, and in spite of what might look like on the outside as something that could lead to anarchy or simply, the breaking out of mobs. King is pointing out, no, this exists here already. All we're doing is bringing it to the surface, because if we don't bring it to the surface, the problem doesn't get solved. Harley.
And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with his sort of disdain for the Muslim Brotherhood, because it's not so much about a threat, it's just sort of a prediction, a logical prediction. He says, if we can't deal with this tension, I think he calls it creative tension.
Yes.
Excuse me, versus violent tension, that if we can't deal with these tensions reasonably, then like society is just going to implode.
Yeah.
He says the Muslim Brotherhood represents that part of the continuum.
Yeah, their emphasis, and this is kind of an unfair fight. When I teach King, believe me, I'm teaching Malcolm X, I am teaching Black Power, I'm teaching Black Lives Matter, I'm teaching the more contemporary expressions and offshoots of various strains of Black American social and political thought. So it's easier to make it a fair fight when you have more than an hour to do it. For us, we're just doing as best as we can a deep dive into this very pivotal, arguably the most famous essay of the 20th century. And so it's, I'm sorry we don't have more from, as it were, the opposition here in terms of how Malcolm X would respond, which he did, of course. He called the March on Washington the farce on Washington, among other things. But King again, he knew that his appeal was not going to land in all quarters of the country for sure, and he was basically saying you're better off dealing with a nonviolent movement than this other movement that says you touch us, we're going to touch you back. I mean, that's the law. There's your law of nature, right? It's completely fair. Now, in X's defense, he never said that they would be the provokers of violence. He said, no, this is self-defense is intelligence, right? So there's an argument to be had there. But King did not think ultimately that approach and what would ultimately become the Black Power movement with Stokely Carmichael, and when he ousted John Lewis from the SNCC, Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. When that happens in 66 and 67, King predicts that he says that's a dead end, what they are preaching. And so there's a real debate among them on this very question. We've got 7 minutes left. Let me ask you this. One of the final charges that King responds to is that he's an extremist. And apparently, according to these clergymen, preachers shouldn't be extremists. So that's a bad thing. King has two answers to it. He has an initial response, and then on reconsideration, he has a different response. Did you catch those two? How does King react to the charge that he's an extremist, and that is meant in a pejorative fashion? This is my page 4 of the handout that we sent to folks. It begins on page 4. What's his initial response to extremists?
That Black folk are tired of the disrespect, and they're drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation, and on the other hand of a few Negroes in the middle class who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because at points they profit by segregation by unconsciously becoming insensitive to the problems of the masses.
So his initial response, and this is one of the places where he talks about Elijah Muhammad, right, in the Nation of Islam. His initial response is, "I'm an extremist. Wake up." There are these other alternatives to injustice that are being presented out there. But notice, what's the second response after he thinks about the being called an extremist, and at first thinking, I'm not an extremist. My goodness, I'm in between those who are complacent on the one hand and the Black power, Black nationalism of the Nation of Islam. I'm in the middle. I'm anything but an extremist. But then he says, you know, when I thought about it a little more, at the end of the day, he's like, I don't know. Why not be an extremist? Do you see what he does with the charge on reconsideration?
He starts naming all the different people throughout history who've been extremists. Jesus, Paul, all of those different people that he's studied, and says, well, they were extremists and I'm okay being an extremist. Yeah. In other words, if you're going to group me with, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln, okay, I'm good with that. Paul, and if you're most of the clergymen are Protestants or Catholics, right? So if they don't like Paul, they don't like most of the New Testament. So that's a problem. Do you guys know who, oh, this one, I highly doubt any of your students would know who this is. John Bunyan. Do you guys know who John Bunyan is? Not Paul Bunyan, not the Blue Ox guy. Who's John Bunyan?
Pilgrim's Progress.
Pilgrim's Progress, the most widely published book in the English language of that century was Pilgrim's Progress. And John Bunyan was thrown in prison because of what the powers that be considered the more orthodox interpretation of the Bible. John Bunyan read the Bible for himself and drew his own conclusions. And for that, he was thrown in jail. Okay. He was considered an extremist. So notice King cites religious, he cites prophets, he cites religious heroes, if you will, of both the Jewish and Christian faith. But it's not just religion. He also cites icons of American political history. And of course, he'll later deliver his I Have a Dream speech at the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial. So at the end of the day, King's okay with the extremist charge. He's like, okay, those are guys who got things done. Those are guys who went down in history because they weren't complacent. They actually were trying to do good. And it in many cases cost them. And King's fine with that. All right, I've got 8:07. Are we ready to go into breakout?